We're about to jump into the 20th century. I've been spending the last couple days going through all of this and realizing how really complicated this century is. So I'm going to try and organize the material in such a way that it's not quite as chaotic as it probably actually was at the time. Here's our timelines, and I've said before how much we just love timelines. I love them. It's how I understand the world. And this is the 20th century. We basically think of it in relation to the two wars, World War I, World War II. This makes basically three parts. We look at what's called the pre-war period, which is right up to World War I, and then the interwar period, which is basically the decades of the 20s and 30s primarily, and then post-war. But the post-war period is really sort of divided itself into really about the first decade after the war, maybe 15 years, which is the culmination of modernism. As we'll see, modernism really ends during this period. It's sort of the last gasp of modernism. And then somewhere in the 1960s, we enter postmodern world, which we refer to as contemporary, the contemporary world. And the definition of contemporary has changed over time. 30 years ago, anything after World War II was considered contemporary, but we now have a better view of this period, and we recognize that it's really just the culmination of an artistic program that started way back in the 19th century, and that the real change happened somewhere in, between 55 and 65, things changed dramatically. So this is how we're going to talk about it. And I want to just go through some of the basic characteristics before we start looking at the art. I threw in 21st century because we actually will look at, near the end, a few things from the 21st century. But one thing that all of this period has in common is that it's really inherently different from the 19th century or earlier, in that it's predominantly conversations about art. It's artists making art that speaks to what art is. And that idea of art talking about art, the roots of it are earlier. The roots of it really go back to the post-impressionists. The post-impressionists, Cezanne and Van Gogh and Gauguin and Seurat, they were really having a conversation with Impressionism, and were really speaking to that, but adding their own sort of ideas. So it's not completely new or unique to the 20th century, but that is a characteristic we're going to encounter. So dialogues on the nature of art. In the pre-war period, this really is a continuation of 19th century agendas. Everybody, the three major movements of this early pre-World War I period are all sort of continuing and taking it to the next level, things that began with the post-impressionists. The search for modernity becomes framed a little differently. Remember, ever since the mid-19th century, people have been trying to define that term, and writers like Baudelaire were talking about what it means to be modern in terms of how you experience change, and how, we live our lives so differently, and it's much faster, and change happens faster, and that's what defines the modern world. And so we saw artists trying to represent that idea of change, things constantly changing. We saw it in the Impressionists, and we saw it in the Post-Impressionists in particular. But in the early 20th century, they stopped asking about modernity and start looking at the idea of creativity, which is a new word that, believe it or not, I am not used yet in this entire class, because it's very much a 20th century concept, the idea of creativity. What does that mean? Where does it come from? So they begin looking for the source, and they're going to look in a lot of really interesting places, as we're going to see. You don't begin looking for something like that unless you feel like there's a problem in your own era. There's something wrong. They weren't seeing it as creative. So how do we be creative? Who's creative? And how do we make art like they did? The other thing we're going to see that predominates through definitely through the pre-war and the interwar period, is a new conception of what truth means. Definitions of reality, different people trying to define what reality is and what truth is. And the one thing they can all agree upon is that it's not the outward appearance of things. That traditional sense that, well, reality is what I see when I look at a thing. It's outer surfaces define its nature and its truth. And everyone agrees by this time that that's not the case. That truth and reality are not found on the exterior. They're not surface issues. There's something else where real truth comes from. So they're going to be looking for that. The interwar period, which is my own area of expertise, all my own work has been in this period, the 20s and the 30s, as you can see, dominated by the symbolist tradition. Of all the 19th century movements, the post-impressionists are very influential on the pre-war, but by the interwar period, the symbolist movement of the 19th century is going to predominate. And all of these ideas of what we define as high modernism really come out of the symbolist tradition, because they're the first to really question, reject realism, reject the outer appearance of something, and search for something internal that's somehow truer than what you see on the surface. And what I was always found fascinating in this period is this sort of contradiction between the 20s and the 30s. And they couldn't be more different. The 1920s was a period of extreme optimism. World War I had just ended. It was known as the war to end all wars, because they truly believed we learned our lesson. It was so horrible. We're never going to do that again. And so they really had moved into almost a utopian optimism that defined the 20s, right? It's the roaring 20s, right? Everything goes. Everything was optimistic and positive. Well, that overindulgence of the 20s is what led to the collapse of the 30s. 1929, it all comes crashing down. This is a period of abstract form and non-objective form, and we'll talk about those, because these were seen as the forms to express this new golden age. But of course, that all ends, because by 1930, it was obvious they were not in a new golden age. And we're going to see how people react to that. The collapse of optimism, a new war was imminent, fascists were in power all over the Western world. So, their utopia that was to end all warfare simply wasn't going to happen. And that's pretty depressing. So it's an interesting period. The post-war period, the biggest influence we will see is that the Western art world moves to New York. During World War II, artists fled Paris. A lot of them went to London, but London was being bombed too. So many, if not a majority, some movements, like all of them, they moved to New York and brought with them the Western art world. So when the war was over, Europe was still in economic decline for a very long time after that war. So many of them stayed longer, or if they went home, New York still remained the center of the art world. And it was the center of the Western art world for a very long time, until about the 1970s. Somewhere in the 1970s, art became global. And there's really no such thing anymore as a Western contemporary world, an Eastern contemporary world, an African contemporary world. There's just a global art world today. And that's a very different world that we live in. So modernism ends, the quest for modernism ends. I like to think that New York kills modernism, because as soon as modernism comes to New York and American artists take over, it really sort of ends the whole thing. I mean, they didn't kill it. It had run its course. And also, as we'll see when we get there, the American take on modernism is inherently different from the Europeans. American art is different. American artists were different. And it led to the birth of a post-modern world, which was decried in the 70s people thought there were any number of articles in journals in the 1970s that said art is dead, you know, art is over, painting is dead, all these horrible doom and gloom, but it really wasn't at all. It just changed quite dramatically and became what we call a pluralist art. And what that means was from the 1970s on, contemporary contemporary art opened. It opened doors to basically anyone who, excuse me, who wasn't, finally it opened the doors to anyone who wasn't a straight, white, European male, because that's who made modernism. And those doors open to vast numbers of people, and that changes the whole face of the art world, as we will see. So that's our preview. So let's go back and talk about the early pre-war period. The earliest 20th century movement in Paris was known as Fauvism, and it's a short-lived movement. They kind of begin a little bit around 1901. 1903 is when the principal group meet one another. And by 1907, they're over because a new avant-garde has come to Paris by 1907. It's very short-lived. The word fauve means the wild beasts, and it's a word that was applied to them by an art critic. He was meaning it quite negatively, but you know, the name just stuck. It doesn't really look all that wild to most of us today, relatively so, but in France at the time, it certainly did. The Fauves, and there were principally 3 of them, and then a number of other artists who were sort of on the fringes and influenced by them, were directly influenced by the post-impressionists. And what they were interested in was examining the nature of form, pure color, and how it communicates ideas and emotions. Now, when I say pure color, what I mean is color that is not there to describe something in the world. If I'm painting a red apple and I paint it red, I'm just using red because the apple's actually red, and I'm just describing the apple by choosing that color. They're interested in the power of the color red, completely aside and separate from anything it might describe. Red as a color has properties, just as a pure color. It's hot, it's passionate, it's emotional, it's dramatic. That's something you can't say about, you know, sky blue is not those things. So colors and shapes and forms have properties. They have characteristics. They communicate ideas and emotions separate from what they describe. And that's what artists are beginning to examine now and explore. Paintings like this, Mountains at Collioure, clearly we see it as a landscape. You know, it's coming directly out of various post-impressionists. You know, there's a sense of Van Gogh's sense of line, right? He was expressive. So the energy of his line is clearly there, the mark making of it. The difference being, Derain feels perfectly free to use color in any way he chooses, where Van Gogh didn't. Van Gogh was still a 19th century artist. And, you know, if a tree is green, he's going to paint it green. You know, he intensifies his colors, but he doesn't necessarily use them arbitrarily. If something is really blue, he'll paint it blue. He might push that to be a very intense blue, but he still doesn't vary from what we call local color. Local color simply means the color that something actually is. So Derain is different. They were very, very conscious, you know, when the year turned 1900 or 1901, if you want to be technical, and the 20th century actually began, they were very conscious of that. They were very aware that, wow, this is a new century, and we're very different, and we need to think differently and find a new formal language for our moment in time. One of the things you're going to be hearing from me a lot, and I briefly mentioned before, is this idea that modernism is about searching for something. The language of modernism, the way we talk about it is through this idea of almost a quest. You know, modernism was almost a kind of spiritual quest, a searching to find forms that speak about your world. We saw that as early as, not so much in the romantics, we began seeing it in the realists, and most particularly the impressionists. They're the first to really show us modernism as a search for a language. How do I describe my world? And that quest is really one of the basic characteristics of modernism. It's what made it such a very masculine movement. There are fewer women involved in modernism than they had been for the 100 years before that. It was a very masculine movement, partially because of how it was framed and how people saw it. Gauguin is a huge influence in Derain. And Gauguin is one of those early 19th century, I should say, one of those 19th century artists who was early in experimenting with color and experimenting with form. You know, he is using some arbitrary colors, and we saw it in other work by him. He and a few others were already experimenting with it. The sort of pools here and shapes and dark outlining, those are things you see in Gauguin. And all these artists would have been known, because once the 20th century begins, these post-impressionists begin having exhibitions in Paris. Now, Gauguin had shown some in Paris in 1893. Cézanne had shown a little bit in 1905, but Gauguin dies in 1903. That means he's going to get a pretty large exhibition in Paris. So he had a big exhibition at the Autumn Salon that year, you know, commemorating him. We still do that. When an artist dies, they get a big retrospective exhibition. It's a fairly common practice. So that's why, as art historians, we need to know not only what artists made, but we need to know where they exhibited, when, who saw them. That's all part of what goes into influencing styles of art. And so Derain and others would have seen Gauguin in 1903. There was a Van Gogh exhibition in 1901. In fact, that's where they met. Two of them actually met while visiting a Van Gogh exhibition in 1901. The most influential artist on the pre-war period, however, is Cézanne, not so much here, but in artists to follow. But he does influence him in terms of the subject matter, the flatness. Remember, Cézanne was interested in the idea of two-dimensional and three-dimensional space, kind of reconciling two realities, the reality of the picture plane, which is flat, and the reality of the subject you're depicting. And Derain is picking up on that very directly. And that's certainly part of influence on him. Another Fauve painter who's working in an entirely different way is Henri Matisse. He's one of the three. And this is his painting called The Joy of Life. It's large, 6 foot by 8 foot. Now, this is not a landscape. This is not in the realist tradition at all, but it's in the symbolist tradition. It's an imaginary scene, something he's invented. He's giving us a landscape, but it's sort of visionary. It's almost like a Garden of Eden, a sort of man in the state of nature. There's a sort of innocence or purity here that nudes are suggesting, something idyllic. And that dreamlike quality he's communicating through the way he's using color. Now, this is totally arbitrary colors, right? The colors sort of merge into one another. There's a fluid, everything's very fluid. That makes them sort of dreamlike and suggesting that dreamlike quality of the piece. Matisse wrote, all these artists in the 20th century write a lot about what they're doing. They feel the need to explain, to talk about, to tell people, because this is theory-driven art. This is art driven by ideas, not necessarily by what you see in the world, but how you're thinking. And one of the things that Matisse said is that there is an inherent, this is a quote, there is an inherent truth which must be disengaged from its outward appearance. This is the only truth that matters. exactitude is not truth. So he's really speaking clearly to this belief that's underpinning everything, that exterior surface appearance is not the same as truth. Now, here's a symbolist work. We didn't look at it before, but it's a symbolist painting, Dawn of a Dream from 91. And this is the tradition that this work by Matisse comes from. It's someone having a dream, someone having a vision. It's primitive work, it's escapist work, and the other thing that we see here is the influence of Cézanne, not his landscapes, but his more romantic large bathers. There's a number of images from this early period of sort of nudes in nature, which becomes a kind of metaphor for a simpler time, a sort of pure world, uncorrupted. We see it especially in German art, which neither of these are, but it does appear a lot in German art. So Fauvism is sort of one early group of artists in Paris who are experimenting. And I think the best way to think about all of this pre-war art is to think of it as experiments. These are artists who are searching for something, and they're going to try something and see how it works, and then they're going to try something else and see how that works. So they're experimental. When we look at both of them, Derain is giving us a realist subject. Matisse is giving us an idealist subject. I use the word ideist as opposed to idealist because idealist has its own meaning, and that's really not what we're talking about. We're talking about a work of art that comes from the imagination or from an idea or something in someone's mind. Now, remember in the late 19th century how those two things were complete opposites? We had the realists on one hand, we had the symbolists on the other. They both thought the other one was destroying art. They were avid enemies to one another. They couldn't possibly coexist. Well, it's like 5 years into the new century, and suddenly in the same movement, we have two artists working together, and one of them is making a realist painting and one of them is making an idea-driven painting. So how is that possible? How can this battle that was so important for 20 years suddenly disappear overnight? Well, and it does actually disappear overnight as a debate, because when you think about it, what the realists and symbolists in the 19th century were arguing about was the subject matter. They were arguing, what should the subject be? Should the subject be a landscape? Should the subject be a visionary scene? Once you get to the 20th century, subject is less relevant. These artists really don't care that much about the subject. It doesn't matter whether it's a realist subject or an imaginary subject. They care about form. They care about the colors, the shapes, the lines, and how those things communicate. So once you diminish the significance of the subject matter, then there's no reason to argue whether it should be realist or idealist, because it frankly didn't matter to them, or it wasn't important enough to have an argument over, because what really mattered was form. Now, a little bit later, in Germany, a movement was developing that had a lot of the same goals as the Fauves, but in the hands of Germans, it's going to take a very different form. Fauvism was a movement of about 3 people centered in Paris. I want to say something. Yeah.
Okay. You mentioned 2 names. What is the third name?
Oh, Vlaminck.
Vlaminck.
Third artist, it's VL. V as in Victor, L, A-M-I-N-C-K. Vlaminck is his name.
Okay.
And they do make an interesting threesome, but I didn't see any need to bring in all 3 of them.
Okay.
Okay. So, but before we look at this, I want to say something about the inherent difference between art in France and art in Germany. One of the big differences that shapes the development is that France had one artistic center, one heart, and that's Paris. That's it. If you were going to be an artist in France, you went to Paris. Germany never had a single artistic center. There were major artistic movements in many German cities. There's a Berlin group, there's a Munich group, there's a Dresden group, there are groups of artists in Freiburg and different university cities. And that was true in the 19th century. It's true even today. And that's going to mean there's a lot more variation in German art than in French art. And we'll see that even in this movement. So when I use the word expressionism as a movement, I'm really referring to many different groups of artists, like 4 or 5 different groups of artists lumped together under expressionism. And there are even individual artists who weren't really part of any group who we put into this group of expressionists. So it's a very different, it's a movement, not really a style or a group. We've seen German art before. We know it's expressive by its very nature, and I'll remind you of some of that in a minute. This is a painting by Ernst Ludwig Kirchner. He was part of a group called Die Brücke, or the Bridge. They were in Dresden early on, and then they moved to Berlin. And this is painted right after the group sort of moved to Berlin. And it's a street scene, a street in Berlin. And it has many of the properties that Fauve had, in that it's experimenting with form, in this case with line and shape. It's painted with these slashing brush strokes. I mean, when you look at it, they're very aggressive, sharp, slashing strokes, almost like knives across the surface. Their faces are all sharp and pointed. There's something very, very dramatic about it. Color, they're very unusual colors. He's experimenting with different kinds of space, that's very compressed space. This is a very anxious painting. There's a lot of anxiety in this painting. It's sort of stressful, and it's meant to be. It's almost impossible not to read into this some of the anxiety that is in the air on the eve of World War I. I mean, this is Berlin in 1913. I mean, we're literally on the eve of the war, and building to that war was beginning as early as the 1890s. Militarism was growing, and tension and the like. So, the anxiety is part of it. This group, Kirchner in particular, they really saw their culture as really corrupt and immoral. They were very much moralists. And what we have here is 2 prostitutes. Those women are identified as prostitutes. This is a sort of thing that someone at the time would have recognized, that it's pretty hard for us to recognize that that's what's going on. And one of the women is looking over at this guy, and he's looking away, sort of embarrassed by her. So he is speaking about morality and aggression and the like. Now, the forms he uses are influenced by what is referred to as primitive art. This period is absolutely obsessed with what they call primitive art. We were beginning to have, in Berlin, we have some of the first exhibitions of children's art, some early exhibitions of African art and oceanic art from non-Western cultures. They called anything that wasn't Western art was called primitive, and that included folk art. So when they say primitive, they mean any of these other sources. And they saw in that art a creativity that they felt was lost from the more academically inspired Western art tradition. And so they're intentionally looking at the simplicity of children's art. Now, why is that important? Well, they saw this art as more creative, as somehow simpler, somehow less sophisticated, as if a lot of education in art is going to somehow destroy your creativity in a way. And so we're going to see them intentionally making art that looks simple or primitive, as a way of hopefully tapping into this idea of creativity. We're going to talk about that more in other work as well. Reminding you of some German art we've looked at. We looked at the late Gothic Vesper build, the Renaissance altarpiece by Grunewald. And in both of those cases, I talked about the tradition in German art to be highly emotional, rather intense, sometimes aggressive, but quite powerful because of that. And we see that carrying into this particular period. So as a moment of cultural decline, that's certainly how Kirchner saw it. And in fact, he didn't even know yet that they were about to be on the verge of war. Van Gogh is certainly an influence. Van Gogh is the most expressive of the four post-impressionists. He was the one who wasn't French, so he didn't have that sort of cooler, less emotional French sensibility. He was Dutch. And his observations of the city light and the cafes at night and street scenes, these are things that influenced Kirchner. But the single greatest influence on the artists in Berlin was the work of Edvard Munch. Munch was actually in Berlin at the time he painted The Scream. He spent several years in Berlin. He influenced a whole generation of young Berlin artists, and his presence there led directly to the Berlin secession movement. Secession movements were popular in the late 1890s, and basically that was when a bunch of young artists would get together and formally secede from the official group of artists. It was a sort of series of movements. It was the Vienna secession and the Berlin secession and the Munich secession. We didn't have one in Paris because those artists left the academy a long time ago, but in other places in Europe, their academies were not as stifling as the French Academy. So a lot of avant-garde artists were still working through their academies until the end of the century. And that's when they, staged their own secessions and broke away from the system. And the person who triggered that was really Edvard Munch. We see that emotional style, that power of the form, the way he used these curvilinear forms to suggest, the sound rising from the body and, the emotional intensity, the sharp angles, all of that is in Munch. And he appealed very much to the Germans. It was very close to their sensibility. Okay, it's yellow cow time. And if you don't have Mike and Joyce on your screen, you might scroll through and take a look at them, because hanging right behind them is the yellow cow, which we've been looking at since the beginning of the class. Franz Marc was part of a group that was working in Munich. He was part of a Munich group, and the Munich group was really quite different from the Berlin group. The Berlin group was sort of driven by morals, and they felt the society was corrupt. The Munich group was very different. It was much more diverse, and it wasn't really sort of negatively speaking about anything. It was much more kind of spiritual in a way, and primarily influenced by the next artist we're going to look at, Vasily Kandinsky, and other people writing in Munich at the time. But the spirituality of the Munich school had to do with their belief in the sort of spirituality of particularly colors and forms, that these were powerful forms. This is coming right out of the symbolist tradition of mysticism and the like. Remember, the mysticism and the occult was part of the late 19th century. There were many different groups, artist collectives. Nature was seen as, rejuvenatory. Marc in particular had strong connections to animals, that they were sort of uncorrupted in a way. He focused, after 1907, really just focused on animals. He developed his own sort of color symbolism that evoked kind of metaphysical realms through color. For example, yellow, he said, signified gentleness and cheerfulness, and he associated it with the feminine. Blue was more intellectual. He associated that with the masculine. I mean, he's not the only one to do this, as we'll see. We'll talk about this in just a little bit. But we see a lot of these different animals and different colors, and you just have to kind of read what he has to say about what these colors mean, or what these animals signify. That's what he's really expressing. So that's our yellow cow. It's a beautiful image. But the artist I want to spend more time on is the most important, really the most important artist working in the pre-war period, one of the most important of the entire 20th century, and certainly the most important working in Germany and Munich, and that is Wassily Kandinsky. There's one really important thing to remember about Wassily Kandinsky, and that is something you may have already noticed in his name, is that he is not German. He's Russian. That's a Russian name. However, he is living and working in Munich, and he was part of this German expressionist circle. But the fact that he's Russian is very important. He actually spent much of his life outside of Russia. He grew up in Italy, and I don't remember what his father did, but he traveled a bit. He is very well educated in law, economics. He studied ethnology, anthropology, music. He was a violinist, and apparently could have followed that vein and been a professional violinist, but chose to be a painter. He had very strong feelings about the power of, in particular, color. This street, this is absolutely stunning. It's a small painting, 13 by 18 inches. Is depending on your screen size, it may not be that much bigger than the screen you're looking at, but it's filled with this spiritual intensity that's deeply Russian. Russian art, we're going to be looking at other Russian art in a little bit. Russian art has deep mystical roots. And that has to do with sort of the history of Russia. Western Europe had been going through an industrial revolution since at least the early 19th century, even in some places into the 18th century. It was a slow transition from an agrarian society to a modern industrial world. Russia had not been going through that at all. At the beginning of the century, Russia, and before the Russian Revolution, Russia was basically still an agrarian society with an almost medieval social structure. You still had the czar, you still had serfs. It was a very different world from Western Europe. And at the time of the Russian Revolution, which we'll talk about a little later, in 1917, one of the reasons the Bolsheviks were welcomed was that they promised to bring industrialism and the modern world to Russia. And they did quickly. Russia's history is so odd, and we're still seeing the results of that. Much of what is happening in Russia, even now, is still fallout from the way they experienced change from an agrarian to an industrial society, which was practically overnight. So
Peggy,
the world, yes.
it might also be worth noting that Russia was almost untouched by the Protestant Reformation as well.
Mm-hmm.
So that whole way in which religion intersected with society, economics, politics, none of that happened in the Eastern Orthodox traditions in the same way.
That's really interesting. I never thought of it that way, but it actually fits perfectly with the intensity of that mysticism that so dominated Russia. When Kandinsky is a boy, you know, icons were still playing an important role in the East, and relating to even back to the Middle Ages, these aren't just pictures of people and things. These are mystical objects. The colors, remember the gold, all of the forms in them are mystical. And you know, he grew up with that, and he never lost that. To Kandinsky, he's a modern artist, as we'll see, but he brings with him this tradition of the mysticism of images, and it underlies his work in a way that's really unparalleled. We're going to see that in other Russian work as well, even sort of stained glass work. And you can see that even in this beautiful painting, it does look like a stained glass window. I mean, his sense of color is really profound. You know, he's influenced by others as well. This is one of Seurat's of the pointillist works, where you can see, you know, the breakdown of color and light. There is that in the painting. But what I wanted to talk about is the influence of theosophy. Theosophy was certainly important on the symbolists. It's going to play a huge role in the 20th century. Many 20th century artists were members of the Theosophical Society, as Kandinsky was. And it ties really beautifully into these contemporary ideas. He wrote a very important book in 1911. It's just a small book, and it's a very interesting book. It's called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And this is where he lays out his ideas about the nature of color, how it is expressive. He links it to music. Certainly synesthesia still playing an important role. He uses metaphors like color, plucking the strings of your soul, as a piano plucks the strings of the instrument. I mean, it's all of this sort of connecting of the senses, connecting of the artistic expression, that every work has a spiritual value that seeks material form. And he speaks about inner necessity, which is this spiritual value you have inside of you that seeks to express itself through color, through music, through whatever. So it's a deeply, intensely moving thing. And that ties beautifully with theosophy, which also talked about spiritual vibrations, and used this conception. You know, this is a period where before and after World War I, where everything is changing in people's worlds. Everything they thought was fixed and unchanging was being proven wrong. You have Einstein talking about relativity. You have people talking about things like X-rays and electrons. You have Freud, who's been writing now for well over a decade about why you do the things you do, and you thought you were rational and made choices. No, you don't. This is where they're coming from. You have Ford, and I must say how important Henry Ford is to European development. His autobiography was one of the best-selling books in Europe, and he was radically restructuring ideas about how business works, how manufacturing works. It's sort of a second industrial revolution, the assembly line processes and the like. And this is affecting everything. You have sort of radical thinkers in every field. In anthropology, you have Claude Lévi-Strauss. In sociology, you have people like that. In physics, you have people. In business, you have people radically rethinking. So I think I would be more shocked if art didn't reflect this kind of radical rethinking of the way things are. It was almost as if someone pulled the rug out from under you and just basically said, well, you know, everything you believe, well, you're wrong. And all of that is happening at once. And theosophy is now being pulled out. It almost like been around for quite a long time, but now they're grabbing it for other things. Now, it's not that theosophy is influencing these people. It's just that they see in theosophy a philosophy that seems to validate the point of view they already have. So they're thinking this way, and oh, look, somebody said this, that validates what I just said. It gives a philosophical foundation to ideas, because, you know, Madame Blavatsky and other writers were also trying to link science and the occult. It wasn't just the occult. And in this work, this is sort of a pure explosion. You know, this is form released from its attempt to speak about the world. It is, you know, completely freeing it from that. Now, let me tell you what I mean. You know, it's the only way you're going to see form is to release it from that obligation. When we look at this shape, 99% of people are going to see a house. But what if I showed you that? Now you see form. As long as it's a house, you're never going to see the form, the square and the triangle. You'll never see them because that's how our mind works. We see pictures in the clouds, we see patterns. Our mind sees things from the real world in random abstract patterns. The only way to really look at the forms is to completely separate them from any sort of reference. Now we see the true nature of a triangle. We see the true nature of the color blue, how it affects us. So when we look at this, we see something now where line and color, which have been inextricably linked before this, usually line framed color, and they work together. Now they're blown apart. Now they're separate. Now we can really see how what emotions yellow expresses, what emotions green expresses, as opposed to a yellow car or a blue house. I mean, those are different. So this is where this is coming from. And Kandinsky is one of about 5 people who simultaneously create the first non-objective paintings all at the same time, unbeknownst to one another. And it's all happening in 1911, 12, and 13 in many different places. Now, the third movement is probably the best known of the 3 to most people. So I want to talk about Cubism, but before I do that, I want to say a little bit about Picasso himself, because he's certainly one of the 2 founders. These are early Picassos. He was 14 when he did these 2. Lest anyone think the man can't paint, I want to show you he can. He could as a child. These are quite stunning, especially that figure study on the right. That is not easy to do. For a 14-year-old to do that is really quite precocious. And he was. He's Spanish, of course, working in Spain. And in his early work, he comes to Paris very early. I can't remember the date he first goes to Paris, but he's in Paris for most of what is happening there. And he sort of goes as a young artist through these stages of what is happening. You know, this is his symbolist phase. He gets to Paris early in the 20th century, and these are his symbolist works. I mean, that self-portrait is very similar to Munch's self-portrait. The one on the right, sometimes that's called his blue period because, well, they're blue, but there's also a melancholy sense of his blue period paintings. But by 1907, things have changed dramatically. And this self-portrait of 6 years later couldn't be more different. So what is happening that is making that change? What's happening is a number of exhibitions in Paris, and we'll talk about what has changed his life. But this is certainly one of the most famous paintings of the 20th century. It's extremely well known. It's not a Cubist painting, although it's often called that. It's what I call proto-Cubism. It's Cubist in form, but not in subject. And he's not going to make that shift until he begins working with another artist. Very famous painting, very Picasso actually. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon. It means the women of Avignon, but it does not refer to the city, the French city Avignon. It refers to the Avignon district, which is an area in Barcelona where the prostitutes were. It's sort of the red light district of Barcelona. So these are prostitutes, and he tells us this very clearly. If you look at that and see very scary, aggressive women, you're seeing it the right way, because that's what it's meant to be. This is a memory. This is someone who's expressing his memories of his youth, seeing these women and being absolutely terrified of them. This is sort of a nightmare. This is a sort of psychological nightmare of a young man who, on the one hand, is drawn to the women because there's an alluring quality to them as well, but at the same time, completely terrified of these very sexually aggressive women. He called it his exorcism piece, which tells you a lot that, he's trying to use this to sort of exorcise these demons of this sort of fear of these aggressive women in his life. And it's meant to be that. Now, the way he's creating this space is a very different one. He's giving a kind of physical form to, these are meant to be curtains that are being pulled back, but all of the space is given a kind of form. It's sort of chopped up and choppy, and this is what's going to lead into this particular direction of what is Cubism. One of the influences on this is Cézanne's bathers. I mean, look at this date. Cézanne actually doesn't die until 1906. I mean, these people are working, you know, the Fauves are still working. Cézanne is still alive and working. He dies in 1906, and there's a huge exhibition of his paintings in 1906 that, of course, everyone sees, Picasso sees, and there's no question this is a direct reflection of that. It's influencing him, and he may even be having a kind of conversation with it. It may be, now here's my response to that. That sort of, you know, Cézanne's is a sort of innocent nudes in nature. Picasso says, wait a minute, they're not so innocent. And this is where we talk about, you know, this is the essential difference between naked and nude. And these are two inherently different ideas, not in terms of definition, but in terms of connotation. All you have to do is stop and think about when you would use each word and why would you choose this word over that word. Then you realize what the connotation is. You know, we have nude models in drawing classes. We would never say we had a naked model in a drawing class. You would never do that because there are associations with the word naked. And principally the association is that you shouldn't be naked, that you should have clothes on. Something is wrong. If you are naked, it's a bit more sexual. Nude, on the other hand, has some sort of idealized, elevated sensibility that suggests a kind of purity, Garden of Eden before the fall versus after the fall. I mean, that's the perfect example. They were nude and then suddenly they were naked, and they knew it and they were ashamed. I mean, that's the difference. And so Cézanne is giving us nude. It's an elevated theme. It's not off-putting. Picasso's giving us naked women, and that is very off-putting and very disturbing. And while it's hard to sort of point out why you interpret them differently, you do interpret them differently. They're showing their bodies, they're looking you in the face. The other important influence was an exhibition at the Trocadero Museum in Paris of African sculpture. And African sculpture was beginning to be shown all over Europe. Picasso had started this painting in the fall of 1906. And then after he saw the exhibition, he went back and repainted the two faces on the right. Now, it's important to understand why he's doing that. He's not an ethnographer. He has no understanding, or could he care less what those sculptures and masks actually were or what they actually meant. He saw what all the Europeans saw when they looked at that art. They saw something that they interpreted as aggressive and frightening. That's how they saw it. And so he's taking those forms. Today we see it as sort of looting, you know, looting the culture of its forms, where in fact that mask on the top there, that's a damn mask, and it's a symbol of beauty. You know, there's nothing aggressive about it at all. And the other one, Bakota figure, is a reliquary. It's a sort of, it's a figure that protects the spirit after death, and it's a protective spirit. So, but Europeans just saw what they saw, and what they saw was aggressive and frightening, and that's what he wanted to show. But at the same time, they're actually still drawn to these masks, because as they're moving toward greater and greater abstraction of natural forms, who's doing that? Who's been doing that? And who does that better than anybody else? Africans and African sculpture. So they're also going to learn from it and study it and learn how to abstract the human face. I mean, those are both really beautiful abstractions of the human form, a simplification. And that's also something they're going to be looking for. Okay, so when do we get to call it real cubism? Well, that's when you eliminate that emotional content, because true cubism is completely unemotional. It's a total study of form. And Picasso's never going to get there on his own. He's not the person to do that. He can't. He's Spanish. He's very emotional. But who can? Well, a Frenchman can, because the French sensibility is this more withdrawn, calmer world. And that's Georges Braque. Georges Braque and Picasso had the same art dealer. His name was Daniel Kahnweiler, but it doesn't matter what his name was. Kahnweiler brought Braque to Picasso's studio while he was working on Les Demoiselles in 1907. So Braque got to see it. The simple fact is not many people saw that painting. Picasso never exhibited Les Demoiselles before the 1930s. So very few people saw that, but Braque saw it and he was blown away. He had been painting in a kind of fauve style, you know, with fauve colors, etc. But once he saw what Picasso was doing, he went back and started painting like this. The biggest influence on Braque is Cézanne, the other Frenchman, the more classical artist. Now, Cézanne, this is one of Cézanne's, I love this Cézanne, the Bay at Lestat. You know, if you looked at a little area here and blew it up, it would look an awful lot like the painting on the left. Braque is taking it a little bit further, but Cézanne is already exploring this idea of wandering perspective, multiple points of view, opening out form so you see the sides, top, bottom. And all of this still being influenced by Henri Bergson, who I talked about last time. Bergson's idea of duration theory, that reality, as he said, reality is not a spatial experience, it is a temporal experience. That reality is something you form in your mind after a series of experiences, you combine them. That means it's temporal, it unfolds over time. And this is the sort of visual language that Braque is bringing to the mix. Between the two of them, they usher in a short-lived early phase called analytic cubism, and this is what we see here. This is the most abstract that cubism will get. There are still recognizable forms. It's important that there always be recognizable forms. Analytic implies analysis, that what we have here is an image that's been broken apart and fractured, and that's what we see. They're attempting to depict this pictorial reality. Pictorial reality is the reality of a two-dimensional space, right? The picture plane, the canvas, it's flat. If you want to be true to that reality, then you don't want to create that window illusion that you're looking into a three-dimensional space. So how do I do that? Well, they do it through finding a language of planes. It's flat, so I don't want to make implied mass. I don't want to do like a Renaissance artist would and create a form and then put shadows and highlights and chiaroscuro so that it looks three-dimensional, because that's not a pictorial reality. That's a three-dimensional reality. So how do I depict it using, you know, being true to the pictorial space? Well, they're experimenting, and this is a back and forth experimentation. They're working together at this time, and they were working so closely that later they couldn't remember who painted which painting. That's what they always said anyway. They're working so closely. These are two guys who they're separating themselves from the world, and they're like scientists doing these experiments. You know, each painting is another experiment, and they're changing one variable to see what happens, and then they change another variable. You know, you cannot think about these paintings the way you think about something from the 17th, 18th, or 19th century. They're not making these for an exhibition. They're not thinking about who might want to see them or buy them. Those are complete irrelevancies. This is about a dialogue going on between two people who are having a conversation about the nature of art. You know, what is it? How do we communicate this 3D world? And they're still tied to the real world. That's important. This is not non-objective. This is abstract. They've taken real forms and abstracted them. They're still starting with real forms. At the title, violin and palette, you can clearly see the violin. The palette is supposed to be this thing at the top, but I swear I see a human form here. And I can't imagine how you could not see a human form here. This vertical, anytime you see this vertical format, our mind is going to see a human form if it's possible. And so the palette becomes a head, the sheet music becomes like shoulders. I even see an arm reaching around here. I can't help it. They may not have said that, but they had to be thinking human form. Okay, what we have is a bunch of little planes that are sort of slightly over one another. We see overlap. There is space implied here. It's a shallow space, but it is there as one plane slides over another, and they seem to hang on a kind of scaffolding. You have some of these vertical and horizontal forms that create almost a scaffolding, and then forms hang on it. It's almost a constructive sensibility, like they're building or constructing this. This is analytic cubism, and it's short-lived experiment. I don't think of it as a dead end. I think of it as a cul-de-sac. You know, you had to go down the cul-de-sac, make that turn, and now we come back out and we'll try something else. It's the second phase that is really the most influential. And that is called synthetic cubism. And why don't we go ahead and take our break right now? It's just a little after 2. Let's take a few minutes and then we'll look at synthetic cubism, and then move on to our interwar period. So see you in about 5. Okay, let's move on. Excuse me. Am I muted? No. Okay, before we leave this, I forgot to point out the fact that you don't see a lot of color on here, do you? It's very sort of neutral colors. One of the first things they did as good scientists is to minimize the variables. And if you want to really just examine the physical formal relationship, color can really get in the way because color is very emotional. You know, if you've got a lot of color, you're going to have emotion, and they wanted to eliminate that. So as good scientists, they eliminate color, at least in the early phase. However, one catalyst, really the catalyst for change, was when Pablo Picasso created this collage. This is considered the first collage in fine art. Collage, of course, simply means a work of art, a two-dimensional work of art that has extraneous materials attached to the surface. So if you glue something on a paper or whatever, it's a collage. Now, it's not that no one had ever done that. It had been done forever in like folk art traditions and the like, but never fine art. It was never considered fine art tradition. And so that's something different. What we have here, the Still Life with Chair Caning, is a perception of something he saw every day. First of all, it's called synthetic because it's the opposite of analytic. If analysis is breaking something apart to its smaller parts in order to understand them, a synthesis is taking different things and combining them in order to understand the whole. So it's a different way of thinking. And in fact, it's really kind of almost a pure description of what a collage is. A collage is by definition taking different things and bringing them together and sort of stacking them up. So it's that aesthetic, or what I think of as a collage aesthetic. He's also using found objects here, and found object is something new. This is, as far as I can think, one of the first works that used a found object. This paper here is he didn't paint that. That's pre-printed paper. It's a kind of oil paper that you could buy to put in your cabinets or wherever you wanted to put it. And he simply, you know, glued that paper down onto the canvas. The rope is also a found object. A found object is really anything you use in a work of art that wasn't created for that work of art, but created for something else. And you simply chose to redefine it and use it as material in a work of art. It can be, it doesn't necessarily mean you accidentally found it. You know, you chose it. So this is the first use of the found object. And in fact, the collage sensibility, the Cubists don't really use it to its fullest potential. That's for another group of artists who will really understand the potential subversive nature of collage. But here it's just more formal. So what is it we're really supposed to sort of see here? Well, it's a kind of temporal, again, it's rooted in time because you're seeing different points of view and different views as you would experiencing it. But the sort of tables and chairs you would see outside a Paris cafe, they were generally glass-topped tables with chairs like this on the left. I find this picture really interesting. It's this is just sort of plastic covers, but they kind of are printed to mimic the look of chair caning. And at the time that Picasso lived, they were actually, you know, cane chairs, but they also tended to be clear glass. So you're sort of seeing through the clear glass to the chair below. And on the table, there's a newspaper, the words J-O-U-R for journal. Someone's laid a newspaper down and you see the label. There's a glass, a couple of glasses or cups. You're seeing them from different sides, plates, different objects. It's hard to identify exactly what is what because it's this quick temporal point of view. But
Hey, Peggy,
yeah.
but before we leave that, it strikes me that not only is the J-O-U from journal, it also means game in French.
Game, yeah. And I think play. That's undoubtedly part of it. There's often a bit of humor, a little humor element thrown in. That's just Picasso. Even when he's doing, you know, serious works, he'll throw in. So that's very likely and intentional. Yes, good point. That he is playing with reality. as he gives us different languages. This is 2D and 3D. That rope is a three-dimensional form. You know, I also love the way he's playing off the idea of a carved wooden frame. You know, the older traditional wooden frames would be elaborate carved. And so the rope, you know, was the color of wood, and it's sort of a joke on or a play on the carved surfaces as well. But what this work did was, it's like everybody's mind just shifted and reversed, and they stopped fracturing forms and started combining forms. And synthetic cubism isn't really necessarily a collage. You could have a pure painting. This is a painting by Picasso, but now it's the synthetic color has come back. And while everything here is painted, it all creates the illusion of layering, like a collage. They look like, you know, these patterns would probably based on cloths on the table or something like that, but they're cut out so they look like they're built up. And this is the type of cubism that has influence later in work. And then the last thing I want to look at in cubism is something three-dimensional. Can you have cubist sculpture? This is a debate. Is there such a thing as cubist sculpture? It depends how you define cubism. If you define it as a two-dimensional examination of space, then you've just defined away the possibility that you could have cubist sculpture. I don't really care how someone defines it. The fact is, there is three-dimensional art that is meant to be the equivalent of what the cubists were doing on canvas. This is a great example of it. This is revolutionary in so many ways. You know, Picasso was not trained as a sculptor in any way. And so he actually came to three-dimensional art without the prejudices and biases that someone trained in sculpture would have had. And what I mean by that is they would have been trained to sculpt the human form. You know, 90% of all sculpture prior to the 20th century in the Western world was the human form. That's what sculpture was. And if you think about what we've looked at, we saw one romantic artist who depicted a wild animal, right? Rude's panther. But other than that, we've seen human forms. They're monuments to gods or people or kings or whatever. The idea that sculpture could be something other than the human form, it would take someone like Picasso, who wasn't indoctrinated in sculpture, to sort of feel free to do that. But what we have here is really unique and different from anything we've seen before. First of all, it's a good example of what we will see in sort of modernist sculpture, in that it's not really about mass, it's about planes shaping space. It's a very different way of thinking about what sculpture is. In fact, many 20th century artists refuse to use the word sculpture. They don't like it because the word sculpture implies something that is carved or cast, as opposed to assembled. This is what we call an assemblage. And an assemblage is basically the three-dimensional version of a collage. You know, if it's two-dimensional, it's called a collage. If it's three-dimensional, it's called an assemblage. But this is still really quite two-dimensional. You know, each of these pieces, which are found objects, and that's important, create space. You may notice right away that there's as much open space in this piece as there is forms with mass. You know, they're different pieces of wood, but they're placed so that within and around and between them is open space. And artists are going to be talking more about that. It's a different way of thinking about sculpture and the role of sculpture. I want to say a little bit more about the idea of the found object. Found objects in art can be very powerful. In other words, if you take something from one context and put it in another context, it will bring with it all of the associations that it had in its original context. But using a found object is a very good way of layering additional information. And this work is a good example of that. You know, this is wood, but these are pieces of wood that clearly had another function before he chose them. These are not raw wood. These are boards And boards are things that someone's cut out. Some of them are painted. I can see this as pieces of wood you would have found on an old trash pile somewhere, that someone just demolished an old shed and threw these pieces of wood over there. The fact that they're painted and you can see paint dripping down, this gives them a previous context. And when I see this, I see that context, and I can't not see that context. So it doesn't bring a lot of meaning to this particular work, but to other works, as we'll see, it really does. It can bring all sorts of meanings. So we can still see the mandolin through the shapes here, maybe the clarinet through this sort of shape, and the opening of space. So I'll bring this back and we'll compare it to others, but he's using wood. Wood is not a traditional medium in Western art. We saw it for some medieval sculpture, but by and large, it was seen as a bit rough or crude. It's a medium that was popular in carving, in oceanic art, African art, etc. So there's a bit of influence here from those other cultures as well. Okay. I don't want to talk too much about World War I because I'm sure you all know a great deal about World War I. I usually in class talked a lot about it because my students didn't know a darn thing about World War I. They didn't understand the horror of that war or the impact of that war. So I usually give them a pretty gross, over the top account, which I don't really feel that I necessarily have to do for all of you. But the reality of the devastation of that war is pretty difficult for most people today to understand. What trench warfare could be like, what a mechanized war could be. I mean, they were clueless. I just finished rewatching the original Upstairs Downstairs. Remember that from back in the 70s? And near the end of that, well, World War I plays an important role in that. And so it's sort of, you saw it playing out, the sort of British discovering the horrors of that war and what they experienced. But it was traumatic and it was shocking. It was the first use of machine guns, the first use of airplanes, the first use of these new, more advanced mortars and chemical warfare with mustard gas. It was the first war where large numbers of non-combatants were killed and suffered. They didn't have control over their mechanized war. They had equipment and machines and they really wanted to use them, but they really didn't know how to control them. And they used airplanes, those biplanes, those open cockpit biplanes, and they would use them to drop mortars. And the way you did it is you just held your arm out and let go, which basically meant you didn't know where that was going to fall. It could just as easily have landed on your troops or in this village down the road. I mean, it was that sort of war. And you release mustard gas and the wind changes, it could come right back on you or again, go into this village. It was really a war of just people who didn't know what was going on. And there was a lot of opposition. It was immensely unpopular, although, my history books would never tell me that, but it was very unpopular. There was a kind of collective sense of a sort of new self-righteous morality that came out of that war that seemed to be bestowed by this unprecedented destructive capability, that there was a sort of really self-righteous. And there was a great deal of opposition by a younger generation, particularly in certain neutral cities. And this movement called Dada, which I want to talk about, which started during the war in primarily Zurich and New York. Especially in Zurich, you had a lot of expatriates, a lot of German poets, artists. You had French, you had some Americans there. And these are people who were disgusted with Western society. World War I to them was the absolute sign of the complete failure of Western society. And they got together and created this movement which they called Dada, which is basically a kind of nonsense word. Each one of them will give you a different definition. That's sort of part of what Dada is. And I think the best way to understand it is as social critique. This is very much a social critique, and they used anything that they could. It was very subversive, very negative. It's sometimes referred to as anti-art. The earliest expressions were at the Cabaret Voltaire, a site that they created in Zurich. And even calling it the Cabaret Voltaire is subversive, because Voltaire is the ultimate, rationalist, and this is anything but rational. Their strategies that were at the heart of Dada were twofold. One was the gratuitous act, doing something that was totally nonsensical and provocative. And the other is just to make a provocative object, whether it's any kind of object, painting, whatever. But the idea is provocation. I often used to run into people that thought, all modern art was just meant to make people mad and the like. That was never the case. There is only one case where artists set out to just insult people and make them angry, and that was Dada. That was its goal. It was to shake up the way people thought, to reveal inconsistencies. They thought that what they did, the irrationality of their actions, were no more irrational than the Western world. In fact, the only way you could speak about the irrational world they lived in was to be equally or more irrational. It was a challenge. They challenged many things. They challenged the idea of the privileged art object. Most importantly, they challenged institutions, because they were failures. They were all failures. What you're seeing here, Hugo Ball was a poet. And this is one evening, one of the famous evenings at the Cabaret Voltaire, where it was an evening of abstract poetry. And this is, Carouane is one of his poems. If you're trying to figure out what language that is, that's no language at all. Those are completely nonsense words. And he stood there and read his nonsense words while wearing his costume on the left. And needless to say, it caused a riot, and the police were called, and that's exactly what they wanted. This was an attempt to shake up the world. And these were basically the poets. For a poet, it's the most subversive thing you could do, because poetry is, by definition, the minutely calculated intentional use of words. And so this is just the opposite of that. So for a poet to give you a bunch of nonsense syllables and words is, by its very nature, subversive. Contemporary art all comes from earlier periods, and Dada is sort of, in a sense, is the birth of things like performance art and conceptual art and all of the rest. But the most well-known image of Dada, and the most important, is this work by Marcel Duchamp, who is, in my humble opinion, the most important artist of the 20th century. And I think by anybody working today would have to say the same thing. His influence on art since 1970 is unparalleled. And he's my personal hero. And if you want to know why later, I'll be glad to explain that to you. A French artist who worked in New York and Paris. In fact, he was in New York when he made this piece. It's brash, it's boisterous. It's a challenge to Western world. Art used to say things about the world, right? Gustave Courbet, when he painted the Stonebreakers, he was making a profound statement about the nature of the world. Art had a goal. It was a powerful thing that could say important things. So what was art saying during World War I? What was the dominant movement? Well, it was Cubism. And what was Cubism saying about the horrors that were happening? If you looked at those Cubist paintings we just looked at, would you even have a clue of what was happening in the trenches and how the world was destroying itself? No, you wouldn't have the slightest idea. It was completely removed. And one of the things that the Dadaists were arguing was that art was not above anything, that art had just as much of a responsibility to speak about the world. And if it couldn't do that, then we better wipe the slate clean and start all over again. And that's what Dada is. The Dadaists are not saying this is what painting should be. They're not saying this is what poetry should be, that poets should be making up nonsense words. They're not saying that this is a work of fine art. They're not saying anything positive at all. This is purely negative. This is the wipe the slate clean half of that. Now, if you want to attack or assault Western art, what better image to use than the Mona Lisa? This is right at the moment in time when the Mona Lisa had come to everyone's attention. Remember, it had been stolen, it was returned, everyone was talking about it. It was heralded as the greatest work of art. What's the worst thing you could do? You draw a mustache on it. Now, I have to tell you a personal story. I had a Renaissance class. My Renaissance professor came to Leonardo and we were talking about the Mona Lisa. He went into this over the top tirade screaming about what Marcel Duchamp did to the image of the Mona Lisa. He was incensed. We all just were sitting there looking at each other. He was turning red. I was afraid he was going to have a stroke or something. He was so angry that someone would defame this sacred image. And all I could think at the time was Marcel Duchamp should be here. He should see this. This is exactly what he's talking about. This taking of an image of any work of art and treating it as if it's somehow sacred and has no responsibility, because he believes strongly that art has a responsibility to comment about the world. In fact, when we were walking out of class, there were two girls in front of me who were talking, and they were saying like, well, how did he get away with that? Didn't they have guards? How did he put this on the Mona Lisa? And I literally had to stop them and say, he didn't actually do this to the Mona Lisa. You understand that, right? He just had, it was like a card, a little card with an image. And my professor's tirade had been so intense that he gave them the impression that Duchamp must have defaced or the actual work of art, which of course he didn't. It's also important that as part of this challenge was not only challenging the impotence, and that's how he saw it, of Western art, but that he was also challenging what was really quite obvious was by this time was the role that art played as a commodity, because there was never an original work of art of this. There is not now and never was an original. That's not the original you're looking at. You want this work of art? Go take a picture of the Mona Lisa and draw a mustache on it. And you will have just as much an original as ever exists. It was an image that was published in a little flyer. That's all. And every other thing other than that, even that original flyer wasn't original because it's just the printed and there were hundreds of them. So there was never an original. Most of the things you see, and this was true of most of Duchamp's work, he never made originals. If he did have something, he just gave it to somebody. He never sold his art. That's the next question is, well, who's going to buy this? Who cares? He's not talking about, he's destroying the possibility that there could ever be a commodity.
I bet that you could sell an original of that flyer for a lot of money today.
People have subverted his subversion many times. They do it all the time. Performance, someone will do a performance piece and it's documented by someone who photographs it, and then you hang the photographs in an exhibition and sell them. Yeah. And no matter what you do to subvert that system, somebody's going to find a way. Now, it's not only the mustache that is subversive, it's the title, LHOOQ. And I don't know how fluent you are in French, but if I read those letters in French, the letters are LHOOQ. Now, what I said could be interpreted a different way. I could be saying LHOOQ, and it sounds the same as LHOOQ. Now, the phrase below LHOOQ says she has a hot ass. So that is about as sacrilegious. I think that's what angered my professor more than anything. That is so disrespectful to this painting of this woman. I mean, you'd think, first of all, this was a painting of the Madonna, because then you could see where people would get upset, but it's not. It's just a woman. And it's his disrespect. I mean, all of this is part of that statement. It's also image appropriation. You know, he didn't paint the Mona Lisa, he just took a picture of it. So he's appropriating an image. Image appropriation also became, but not for another 50 years, he's about 50 years ahead of people who are going to understand what he was doing. And his impact, he has no impact for the next 50 years, but he will have in 50 years, and image appropriation will become a very important strategy in contemporary art. And it all comes from this. So I think the best way to understand this work is as visual art criticism. That's what it is. You know, if he were a writer, he could have written an essay, but he's not. He's an artist, so he does a visual. So this is art criticism. And when you think of it that way, it makes a lot more sense than if you try and fit Dada into the traditional definitions of fine art. But it is art, and it affects art to follow, and I think it's perfectly valid that it be treated as fine art.
You know, Peggy,
Yeah.
it reminds me of the literary movement in France, which I think is a little earlier than that, with like Rimbaud and those
Yes.
writers who talked about épater les bourgeois, you know, shock the middle class.
Yes.
This feels like exactly that same sort of spirit.
Exactly. They were all, Rimbaud is going to even be more influential, and Lautréamont on the surrealists who come out of this movement. But this is what begins the irrational. For the Dada, irrationalism was a device, you know, a device to sort of shake people up. Irrationalism is going to be embraced by the surrealists in a positive way. And that's why I don't like to use the word irrational in the context of surrealism, because it has a negative connotation and they don't mean it negatively. Non-rationalism is their strategy, and they see that as a positive thing because they see rationalism as one of the causes they link rationalism with capitalism, materialism, and one of the causes of World War I. And they believe that the loss of the non-rational way of understanding is limiting to human beings. This surrealism comes right out of Dada, and it's different. A lot of the same people go from the Dada movement into surreal. Duchamp is sort of part of that, and many of these surrealist artists, you know, dabbled in Dada, but it's the sort of positive view. It is purporting to put forward what fine art could be. It also comes out of poetry. André Breton is the leader in Paris. It's a search for surreality. Surreality means the reality above, you know, so it's another reality. They believe the over-rationalized world is a limited world. They believe there are different ways of knowing. And the non-rational ways of knowing are things like intuition and instinct, and particularly driven by psychology, as we'll see. The surrealist aesthetic, one of their techniques to create this non-rational world is to combine otherwise rational images or materials, to take one thing that's perfectly rational and another thing that's perfectly rational and put them together in a ground that makes no sense with either one of them. And we're going to see that. So it's basically like a paradox in a way. Goal to create convulsive imagery. What is convulsive imagery? It's imagery that shakes your mind. I mean, just for a second you go, what? And there's no question there's Zen influence here. The idea of Satori, which is that moment, just a moment where, you know, your mind opens our minds are so rational, you know, it's really hard to not be rational, to sort of drop that wall for just a moment and see, and open yourself to something else. And so they're looking for ways to do that. They call it convulsive imagery. And of course, they're directly influenced by Sigmund Freud. Freud's, in 1900, he writes Interpretation of Dreams, but it's not a coincidence that, you know, he translates it. It's translated in 1920 to English and Russian and Italian and a bunch of French, other languages. Freud is a major figure on the international scene in the 20s. After World War I, there were so many men suffering from what they called shell shock, you know, we would call post-traumatic stress, that couldn't be helped by traditional medicine. It wasn't working. And there were these international committees looking for ways to help people. And Freud really came to international acclaim, heading up these international committees. So everybody was already talking about Freud, and the surrealists are fascinated because he's offering something they're really interested in, which is this idea of a subconscious mind. It's interesting in another way, you know, artists are looking for the source of creativity. So maybe I shouldn't have to go look at some other culture. Maybe the source of creativity is inside of me or inside of all of us, and maybe it's in that subconscious. So there are a lot of reasons why they were drawn to him. And early on, what they tried to do was to mimic the techniques of psychoanalysis, which were things like dream analysis, the Rorschach inkblot test, you know, looking at random forms. What do you see in this form? Or even sort of hypnosis and self-hypnosis. They were looking at different ways that mimicked those as a way to tap into the subconscious mind. Max Ernst, a German artist who was, before 1920, part of a sort of Dada group in Germany. He came to Paris in 1920 and was sort of part of the original founders of surrealism there. This is using a technique called grattage, in which he has two pieces of canvas and he puts paint and then smushes the two pieces of canvas together. And when you pull them apart, it leaves these random sort of sticky, gooey little marking things. And then you use that to stimulate your subconscious, and then you draw over it or turn it into whatever your mind, it stimulates in your mind. For Max Ernst, it almost always stimulated sort of landscape images like this. It's also very much in the Germanic tradition of Germanic fairy tales and the kind of dark stories. It's also reminiscent to me of early German films, which, you know, like Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and M, and early German films are absolutely fascinating as well. Certainly writers like Rimbaud talked about the alchemy of the word, and he talked about really how words can be combined to create these images. So and Lautremont as well. The Comte de Lautremont was this French writer, poet. They come out of the late symbolist tradition, but they have a sort of darker side to them. And they do talk about alchemy, which very much influenced Max Ernst. But Ernst's best works, and I honestly think the best works of surrealist art in general, are his two collage novels. And I no longer have it's a book-sized novel. We would call them graphic novels today. He called them collage novels because they're every page is collage, and they're absolutely fascinating. You could look at these books every day for the rest of your life and never tire of looking at these unexplainable images. His first one from 1929 is called La Femme sans tête, and this is another play on meaning, another sort of convulsive meaning. La Femme sans tête, you could write it this way. Sans could be C-E-N-T and mean 100, or you could write sans, S-A-N-S, meaning without, right? So you could translate it as either the woman with 100 heads or the headless woman. Now that's a paradox. You can't have both 100 heads and be headless. So in English, when it was translated, it's translated as the 100 headless woman, which is a paradoxical phrase. So you get 100 headless, you know. So actually it's a pretty good translation of this idea of this paradox. Another example is Andre Breton, the poet, wrote a poem called Soluble Fish. Now you have to think about that for just a second. What is a soluble fish? It's a fish that dissolves in water. It's a paradox. You can't have but just for that moment, I love telling that story because I see them trying to think soluble fish, and then it hits what that means, and then the response is to laugh. People generally laugh. We laugh when we're uncomfortable. We don't always laugh when things are funny. We laugh for a lot of reasons, and one of them is when you don't know how to understand something first. But just for that split second, your mind opened to a possibility, and just as fast, the wall popped up and said, "No, no, no. There's no such thing as a soluble fish. You know, be rational, move on." But if you're open to it, you can glimpse that surreality. I love this image of the Immaculate Conception. These are not codes. They're not decipherable. In fact, you shouldn't try to make it rational, because that ruins the mystery of the magic of the imagery. You know, he had access to a lot of old magazines. A lot of his imagery comes from sort of late Victorian magazines. And while when we look at these today, they have a kind of older feel to them. They did in 1929 too. They also had a sort of older sensibility to them. They're very much like symbolist art. They're suggestive and vague, and a lot of it comes from the same source. This is another one from La Femme Sans Tête, Quietude, the woman. It's like, you know, trying piecing it together. What's that got to do with that? What, you know, you could work forever and begin to make a couple connections, and then it all falls apart again. He's influenced by alchemy. These are divided into chapters that have days of the week, but they're also associated with colors and alchemical symbols, and the layers are multitudinal. And does it all fit together? No, it doesn't. That's kind of the point. It really doesn't all fit together. And he did a second collage novel called Une Semaine de Beauté, which is not the same sort of play, but Une Semaine de Beauté means a week of kindnesses, and there's no kindnesses in these images at all. They're much more disturbing. There's a lot of bird imagery. That's another thing with Ernst. You know, he was obsessed with birds and bird imagery, and it comes from his childhood experiences. Surrealist art often has like very personal very personal associations that sometimes the artist doesn't even understand. You know, why are you obsessed with this? They don't always know what these mean. This is a good example of the sort of Victoriana. This is a very Victorian space, and you know, what's going on here, and what is this creature, and what's that scene, and what's he saying? And it's just filled with questions with no answers, which is so much more interesting than works of art that just give you an answer. I much prefer the open-ended. It's why I worked in this field. Surrealism is my area. Dali, Salvador Dali is one of the later members of the group. He didn't join until the 30s, and he was kicked out actually within 5 years. Dali is better known in this country. Americans tend to think of Dali when they think of surrealism more than people in Europe do, because he spent so much time here in like the 50s and 60s and even into the 70s. So Americans know more about him. He was, you know, prone to fits of rage. He cultivated eccentricities. He was an exhibitionist. His work is muted in a lot of personal obsessions. He was kicked out of the Surrealist group because he was a fascist. The Surrealists were pretty much all members of the Communist Party. Early on in the 20s, they were, as were most intellectuals and artists in the 1920s. That's because communism was the only alternative to fascism at that time. The only anti-fascists were the communists. And also in much of Europe, people thought the communist revolution was actually working for a long time. They didn't know that it really never worked, that it was always chaos there. But, you know, that was the great savior. Communism to intellectuals in this period was going to save the world. And so when Dali reveals himself as a fascist, which he did clearly by 1935, he was a supporter of Franco in the Spanish Civil War. I mean, by 35, fascists are rising everywhere. And so, you know, people were jumping to the communist cause, although they were jumping off of it pretty quickly by the later 30s, as it became clear. When Stalin came into power, people became disillusioned with communism. And then Stalin signs a non-aggression pact with Hitler in 1939. And, you know, of course, that didn't last either. But you know, that's the sort of disillusionment of the 30s. The 20s was hopeful. The 30s were showing that things weren't happening. Dali developed a style for himself. He called it the paranoid critical method. I'm not going to try and define that because it doesn't really mean anything. What he meant by it was the way forms sort of merge into other forms. You know, he's relying on a kind of dream sensibility, you know, and dreams are like that, where one thing will be one thing and then suddenly there's a metamorphosis and it's something else. And that's what people find so fascinating in Dali, is that sort of optical illusion as they move back and forth. He's the only person I know that was so egotistical he had to write 2 autobiographies. The first one was My Secret Life. The second one was Diary of a Genius from 1965, which was, you know, sort of a little over the top. The other scandal relating to Dali was his last 10 years at least. He died in 89, but for at least 10 to 15 years, he had dementia, and he didn't know, you know, what was going on. And people were taking advantage of him, and he was just signing, you know, blank pieces of paper. We found out about this. There was a truck accident in Europe, a truck overturned, and in the back of that truck were hundreds and hundreds of blank sheets of paper signed by Salvador Dali, and they were going to, you know, make prints and sell them as original, because that's an original signature, but the work wasn't original. And I was, well, actually this happened in, I know when this happened, it happened in the early 80s, because I was working here in Kansas City at an art gallery, and we started getting, you know, all these calls about, well, I have a Dali print, you know, it's signed, I have a letter of authentication. You know, what's this worth? And, you know, you have to tell people, well, I'm sorry, nothing, because it destroyed the market in Dali prints. And even genuine earlier prints have no value because it was a real shocker in the art world. Biggest scam in the art world, letter of authenticity. Letter of authenticity means nothing. Because if someone can fake a work of art, don't you think they can fake a letter saying it's authentic? I mean, everyone thinks something's authentic if they have that letter. Biggest scam ever. Okay. One of the major influences on his work, I'm sure you may have, I don't know, maybe you've seen it. You know, his Archibaldo's work is around a lot. People have seen it. He was a Mannerist painter from Italy who made all these images out of vegetables. Have you ever seen all these figures and things made purely out of vegetables? Oddest thing in the world, but he was an, you know, an Italian painter of the Mannerist period, and Dali was fascinated with him. And I can really see that in his work, that although he doesn't use vegetables, it's nonetheless there. We have nice Tanguy. Surrealism is a lot of things. Some of it's abstract. Tanguy, this is in the Nelson. It's a small piece. It's not large in that 20th century room, but Tanguy is giving us a different kind of subconscious. It's a landscape again. They often play out in landscapes. It's kind of mindscape or landscape of the mind. But in this case, it's these sort of fluid metamorphosis of figures. He says it relates to like stone monuments from his past, but it's really just a putting together of different things in your memory come back to you. I have to show you one of Kay Sage's. Kay Sage was Tanguy's wife. There were a number of women in the group, the wives of several artists, but they weren't really in the group. You know, they weren't really allowed to, you know, sign the manifestos, or sometimes they could exhibit with them, but it tends, most of them have better careers, like after their husband dies, they become more prominent, and that's, you know, their late work is better known. But Kay Sage is one of the nicer ones. Moreau, sort of playful work. He's very influential actually on post-World War II art, but he gives us these sort of invented worlds, and these are people, you know, here's a guy, you know, we see his eye and his beard, and a woman here, and fish figures. They're just fun to look at. He's more inventive and very consciously creates these worlds. These psychological experiments with rubbings and grattage and all those are early techniques. They don't do that by the 30s anymore. They're more consciously putting together. But I want to get to Magritte because he's probably the best known. Magritte was part of the Belgian circle, where Magritte, and most people have seen this image when I talk about it. The Belgian group is more intellectual than the French group. And they're more philosophical. They're rooted in contemporary philosophies. Magritte's influenced by Goethe. He's influenced by contemporary philosophies of phenomenology, structuralism. He's playing with image and word. This is titled The Treachery of Images. Now, of course, what it says is this is not a pipe. And most people think that's the title, but it's not. The title's, it's more important than that. The title is The Treachery of Images. And that's the important part of the work. Because the images are twofold. The pipe is an image, but so is that text. I mean, the use of text in a painting as an image is a new idea. We saw it in Cubist work when they put J-O-U-R or J-O-U, whatever. That's using text, but they were using it to make some references, a playful reference, but he's dealing with much more, on a philosophical level. You know, I've heard people say, and usually students will say, well, of course it's not a pipe, it's an image of a pipe. But that's really not what he's talking about here, is an idea. You know, artists dealt with that idea a century earlier. That's not really a thing of the interwar period. Of course, it's not a pipe. We know it's an image of a pipe. What he's playing with more is the relationship between what two different languages tell us. We have two conflicting languages here. We have a visual language that shows us a description of an object, and then we have a verbal language now presented in a symbolic written form, because writing of words is a symbol. And that's telling us the opposite. So we're getting two languages here. One says pipe and one says not pipe. And that's a paradox, but it's playing off this growing interest in text and how language and text work. And later structuralists and deconstructivists are going to look back to what Magritte is doing. But I think more interesting works are, is this. This is a more interesting work. This is the human condition. See, what's he saying here about the human condition? Can you see what we're looking at? We have a canvas here on an easel, propped up by a window, but which one is real? And one seems to be, it looks like a glass you're looking through. So what is the human condition? Is the human condition that we are inherently incapable of understanding reality? Is that our condition, that we live in this perpetually confusing world? It seems to be, and he did 2 or 3 on this subject. We've also got sort of the window looking out, the indoor and outdoor. It's asking questions in an interesting way. But in works like this, Elective Affinities, which is a direct reference to Goethe, Goethe's writings. Goethe talked about elective affinities. You know, most surrealists were choosing things that were completely disconnected from one another in order to create this paradox. They have no relationship. But clearly there are affinities here. Clearly you've got a spatial affinity between them. Sometimes affinities can be a cause and effect. You know, one leads to the other. Sometimes it can be this is about both confinement and cause and effect. You've got, you know, the egg in the cage, but now and of course that's going to turn into the bird in the cage. So there's sort of a cause and effect, but now the egg is itself a cage and enclosing that which is in it like a cage. So this is what I mean by they're philosophical. He's not trying to shock your mind into having a revelation. He's trying to turn your mind to a philosophical question and to think about that philosophical question. You know, Goethe is talked about the sort of human chemical theory. He talked about the relationship between forces. He talked about free will and all of this, creation versus limitation. And this is very much about creation versus limitations. You know, we think we have free will, but are we really born in a cage? And really we don't have complete free will because there are limitations on us from the second we are born. So again, there are a great many associations there. And we're right at 3, and I'm just ready to start talking about non-objective art. And that's what we will do next time. So we'll leave it there. And this is when things really get interesting, because we're going to take a look at Russia, a moment in time when Russia is the center of the art world. And it will only happen for a while Lenin is alive, but it will happen. So we'll turn our attention to Russia and talk about some very interesting things next time. So does anyone have questions or comments on what we've considered so far?
Can't wait.
Oh, good. Usually people aren't that excited about non-objective art, but the simpler the art, the more complex the ideas behind it. That is an ultimate truth. So when you see a big red square on a canvas, it could take a while to explain where that comes from. So yeah, anyway, that's what we'll do next week. So please, yeah.
Were there any art movements in Scandinavia?
They were, well, Munch was from Scandinavia. There were very important symbolists.
Right?
Huh? What?
He didn't stay in Scandinavia, did he?
No, he went back. He traveled a lot, but he lived much of his life there. But there was a huge symbolist circle. Scandinavia has always been a sort of center of mysticism, going way back. There were mystic saints from there. Swinburne, there were symbolist poets. So that symbolist tradition is very, very strong in Scandinavia. And that's sort of one of the major traditions. But, you know, artists are traveling a lot. So most of what is happening, if it's happening in Paris, if it's happening in Munich and Berlin, it's probably happening in all over Europe and New York. So, but no specific person that I would point out since Munch. But there are major artists working there.
Peggy, you
Yes.
didn't mention like Rualt or Otto. I always think of them as being part of the expressionists. If I got them in the wrong.
I could give you a very long list of the people I didn't talk about. Yes, there are vast numbers of people. I just pick and choose. We don't have the time to talk. We would spend a month. We could do a whole course on German expressionism easily. It's been 3 months on that. Then we'd get to see those people. But yes, those are important people. Otto Dix, Max Beckmann. I hate not having time to look at Max Beckmann. He's one of my favorite artists.
Yeah.
And Rouault, I didn't do Rouault because he's not really a great example of anything. He's kind of unique. So I'm choosing the people whose work is the most typical in a sense. It's the best example of this movement. So that's sort of on a level where you're giving a broad overview. You don't want to, focus on the one who's an exception or not typical. So that's why I brought in some people and not others. Sorry, I wish I could. Maybe we'll do just a whole 20th century sometime, and we could take more time and look at all these people.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, everybody.
Anyway,
Well,
Thank you.
riveting,
you.
absolutely riveting, Peggy, as
Well,
always.
Yes.
please jump in with questions anytime, because if I don't say things correctly, I can try and say them again. Okay, thanks.
Thank
See you
you.
next
Thank
time.
you.
Happy Halloween. Bye-bye.